The Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown, chapters 1 through 5. This book takes place in the crux of the Great Depression and the beginning of World War II in the United States. It begins with a description of the battered ambience of Seattle's waterfront. Children woke up in cardboard boxes, and wooden crates used as houses crisscrossed into formations of towns called Hoovervilles. Only several years after the market crash, millions of Americans had lost their jobs without prospects of finding a new one. Joe Rance, the main character of the story, grew up in this era of America. He was the second son of Harry Rance, a mechanic, and Nellie Maxwell, a pianist. At first, Joe recounts beautiful early childhood memories of singing with his family in the living room of his house in Spokane, Washington, and going to festivals during the springtime. However, at the age of 4, Joe's mother died, and he was sent to live with his aunt Alma. Joe contracted scarlet fever and almost died. Joe's father, out of grief, escaped to Canada, and his older brother Fred went off to college and married a country girl named Thelma LaFollette. When Joe was 5, his father returned, and Joe went to live with him and his new wife, Thula LaFollette, the twin sister of Fred's wife. Thula, young and naive, would later be disappointed with her marriage to the older Rance as her standard of life slowly declined. Joe's transition back to live with Harry thus began a dreadful roller coaster journey of loss, abandonment, hope, and self-reliance. For example, the narrator describes, at the age of 10, Joe was forced to live by himself in a rented room at school because Thula could not stand him in their house. When Harry, Thula, and the children decided to move away from Washington, they did not allow Joe to come with them and left him in a half-built house by himself. At the age of 15, Joe was deserted by his only family, and he learned the true meaning of betrayal and loneliness. After a few years of solitude, Joe's brother Fred, acting as both father and brother to Joe, sent him a letter and enrolled him into Roosevelt High School in Seattle. He later matriculated to the University of Washington for engineering and tried out for the freshman rowing team. In the 1930s U.S., rowing was an extremely popular sport. The best rowing programs in the country were mostly concentrated in the East, such as those of Harvard, Cornell, Yale, and Pennsylvania. In the West, the University of Washington competed with its rival, UC Berkeley, for recognition in the national level. In the fall of 1933, Joe, as well as about 100 University of Washington freshman students, lined up in front of the institution's shell house. They knew that making it on the rowing team was extremely competitive, as only 4 freshman boats, one boat fits 9 people, were open to be contested, but only the first and second boats were actually competitive for games in varsity the following years. The prospective freshman group began intensive training and reviewed 3 hours every afternoon. Every day, fewer freshmen showed up to practice as they realized how exhausting physically and mentally the sport is. Joe continued to practice because to him, hurting was nothing new, which alludes to his childhood experiences. Joe eventually made the team, as well as another talented freshman named Roger Morris, thanks to the guidance of Tom Bowles, the freshman coach, and George Pocock, the boat builder for the university. Al Albrechtsen is the varsity and JV coach. Every year, the rowing team practices and races only 2 competitions. One is with a rival, UC Berkeley, and the other one is at a regatta in the East. During the upcoming months to the race with Berkeley, the freshman boat, the one with Joe, struggled. Tom Bowles noticed that Joe rowed eccentrically and out of rhythm with his crew. However, by race day, the crew straightened out their problems and defeated Berkeley's freshman team. They did so again when they raced in the Intercollegiate Rowing Association's regatta at Poughkeepsie later in the year. Joe's crew rode so smoothly during the competition that newspapers all over the nation praised about them. The varsity team did not win at Poughkeepsie to the disgruntlement of Albrechtsen. However, he looks forward to next year's sophomore group, this year's freshmen, who had won all their competitions so easily. Chapters 5 through 10. In the meantime, across the Atlantic Ocean, Adolf Hitler grew to power in Germany. As a method of propaganda, Hitler decided to host the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin to showcase his country. He ordered Werner Mark to renovate buildings and construct the most ceremonial Olympic stadium the world had ever seen. Hitler delegated the details of the project to his Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda Joseph Goebbels and actress and filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl. In late 1933, Germany pulled out of the League of Nations. They began to build weapons and tanks. Rumors about Nazi brutality and anti-Semitism were spreading west, but many people chose to ignore them. A poll at the University of Washington showed that almost 100% of students opposed U.S. involvement with England against Germany. During the school year, Joe worked as a janitor for the YMCA on campus to support himself through college. In the summer, he searched and derived myriad jobs to earn money. He worked at the Grand Kool-Aid Canyon, a project within one of President Roosevelt's programs for the Great Depression. He sold moonshine by stealing from bootleggers. Prohibition was in full effect at this time, and selling them again to his own customers. He illegally fished for salmon in the Douglas River and sold them at the market for money. After he and a friend were caught by the game warden, Joe resorted to safer jobs such as cutting hay, digging ditches, dynamiting stumps, and more for his neighbors. Joe also worked for an old man named Charlie McDonald. Charlie taught Joe how to make roof shakes from wood and stumps. He taught Joe lessons about nature and the importance of things left behind. Joe felt a personal connection with these lessons because as an adolescent, he grew being the one left behind. Joe and Charlie soon became great friends. Joe also spent time with Joyce, his girlfriend and best friend, but her parents were very strict and did not let her out of the house much. Joyce also went to the University of Washington. In the fall, Joe and his crew members returned to the shell house as sophomores. Albrechtsen announced that he wanted to prepare for the 1936 Olympics and vowed that 9 among them will go to Berlin. Albrechtsen had not picked the lineup for the Olympics yet, but a newspaper over the summer had wrote favorably about the sophomores' chances for the Olympics after their great performance at Poughkeepsie last year, which made last year's JV team extremely angry as they wanted to be the new varsity. Albrechtsen wanted to pick a new varsity team from either the sophomores or the JV team. As the team practiced, the weather, a recurring motive in this book, got worse and the sophomores struggled despite their coach's high hopes. Albrechtsen commented that he had a team of too many great individual players and not enough team players. At the Pacific Coast Regatta, Albrechtsen promoted the sophomores to varsity. They won, but the JV team won by a greater margin in their race. At the Poughkeepsie race, Albrechtsen demoted the sophomores and promoted the JV to varsity. They lost. Albrechtsen was humiliated, and many newspapers criticized his decisions to demote the sophomore crew. A good coach must be a good leader, and Albrechtsen had jeopardized his team's trust and skill when he switched the crews. Rumors that Albrechtsen would be fired circled around because his varsity teams had not won any national titles in many years. Chapters 10 through 15. During the summer of 1935, Joe found work at the Grand Kool-Aid Dam. He discovered that 2 of his teammates, Johnny White and Chuck Day, were working there as well. Both were just as poor as Joe and had to work all summer to support themselves for another year of college. The work at the dam was grueling and dangerous. Joe learned how to use a jackhammer to drill away tons of rocks many feet up in the ground. At night, Joe and his teammates found cheap and easy ways to have fun. They went to bars, card houses, and restaurants. The boys became close friends as they realized how similar their dispositions were. Around the same time, Thousands of German men were working on the construction for the Olympic Stadium in Berlin. The narrator flashes to 10 years later, when these men, as well as those who joined Hitler Youth in the 1930s, would be shooting at each other and persecuted. In Germany, many Jewish clubs were beginning to be banned. Signs in stores and buses discriminated Jews from entering and utilizing public utilities. The richer Jews had already moved away to America or another asylum. The less wealthy feared for their lives as the government in which they lived under changed drastically. When Joe returned home from the dam, he learned from his brother that Harry and Thula had returned to Washington. Joe and his girlfriend, Joyce, went to visit Harry, only to be denied by Thula when they stopped by the house. Joyce, having learned about Joe's past, promised to never leave Joe behind like his family did in the past. Joe later learned that Thula and Harry had been neglecting their children when they go off on excursions, leaving them days without food. Joe and Joyce secretly took care of the children when Thula went away. As the year 1936 approached, Albrechtsen announced that he would be officially picking teams to go to the Olympics. Albrechtsen was determined and desperate to go to Berlin this year and had decided to retire if events did not turn out. Meanwhile, more news of Hitler's leadership and maltreatment of Jews were spreading west. Some Americans started to boycott the Olympics, complaining that the new rules in Germany imposed by Hitler were unfair. In December 8th of 1936, the Amateur Athletic Union of the United States voted to send a committee to Germany to investigate claims about the Nazi regime. They found nothing, and the resolution for Americans to pull out of the Olympics failed. The narrator went on to note that several other American Olympic officials went to Berlin to investigate, but their own anti-Semitic views and sense of importance fragmented any protest against the Nazis toward the Jewish, often lumping communists and Jews together and stating that Americans and Jews cannot be the same. Hitler was fully aware of this weak resolve of the West. In the same month, Thula died from septicemia by an obstructed bowel. Joe went to visit Harry and his little stepbrothers. Harry announced that he was going to build a new house and he wanted Joe to move in with him. Joe felt confused and angry because his father could not stand up for him when Thula was alive, and just now he wanted to be with his son. Joe's friend Charlie McDonald also died around the same time from old age. His death and Thula's death rattled Joe. At the show house, Albrechtsen separated the original sophomore crew and mixed them around. He wanted to produce the strongest combination of athletes for the number one varsity boat to go to the Olympics. Joe was demoted to the fifth and worst boat as he was distracted by Thula's death and Harry's new proposition. Albrechtsen asked George Pocock, the respected boat builder, to talk to Joe. Albrechtsen and other coaches regularly confided in Pocock and trusted his advice because he had expertise in rowing. Pocock asked Joe to come up to his workshop and talk to him about rowing. Pocock described rowing as a religion and a spiritual sport. You have to give up yourself and be part of the boat as well as the team. Joe did not quite understand, but he was intrigued in whatever Pocock had to say. Joe started to make friends with the boys in the shell house. He became friends with Stuck McMillan, Shorty Hunt, and Roger Morris. As he built stronger relationships with his teammates, he became a better team player and rower. Teamwork was key to finding the perfect stroke in rowing. One afternoon, Joe and Joyce went to visit Harry and the children again at a new house. Joe went off by himself to Lake Washington next to the house, where he observed the water and suddenly had an epiphany about peace and life. He decided to move in with Harry. Joe returned to the show house the next day, rowing much better as he let go of his insecurities and became one with the boat. To Joe's surprise, Albrechtsen put Joe in the number one varsity boat along with Stub McMillan and Shorty Hunt to compete for the Olympics, even though Joe had struggled to keep up with the other boys for most of the year. The first varsity boat practiced and began to row smoothly, better than any crew the University of Washington had ever seen. With George Pocock's help and Albrechtsen's intensive training, the University of Washington won against UC Berkeley in the first race of the season. They went to Poughkeepsie for the regatta, where Albrechtsen derived a novel strategy. He wanted the varsity crew to keep a low stroke rate at the beginning and then build up momentum at the end. Joe and his crew won at the Poughkeepsie regatta against many teams in the East. They were on a good path to Berlin and the Olympics. Chapters 15 through 19. On April 20th of 1936, Hitler turned 47. Already he had broken the Treaty of Versailles and occupied Rhineland. England did nothing to counteract the show of military force. Encouraged by this success, Hitler plotted to glamorize his fascist country, promoting a mirage of peace while already planning another attack on Czechoslovakia and Poland. In July 1936, Joe and the rest of the varsity crew went to Princeton for the Olympic Game trials. In the preliminary heat, the University of Washington competed against Princeton in the New York Athletic Club and won. UC Berkeley competed against Navy in Pennsylvania and won. In the final Olympic trial, the University of Washington competed against UC Berkeley in Pennsylvania and won again, proving they were the best team in the nation to represent the U.S. Albrechtsen was overjoyed. Joe and his crew packed up for Berlin. They boarded the ship Manhattan to Berlin. On the way, many crew members got sick and lost weight. Don Hume, the crew's talented stroke, became extremely ill. On July 23rd, the boys arrived at Berlin, and they saw an ostensibly beautiful and lively city. The roads were packed with people waving at them. Every storefront had a Nazi or Olympic flag. The crew was led to a grand hotel, and they spent the first week or so exploring Berlin. As Joe noticed the charmingly quaint city, the narrator took the time to describe a Germany in the near, bleak future, the one the boys will never get to see. The narrator describes blood in a saintly lake and Catholics and social democrats beaten until their kidneys ruptured. The boys began to practice rowing, but they performed evidently worse than they did before the voyage. They were most concerned about competing against the British crew because they had more experience than the University of Washington crew, and the country invented the sport of rowing itself. As the date for the Olympics approached, Don Hume's sickness worsened. By the preliminary heat, Don Hume had lost 14 pounds of weight. The Americans managed to win the preliminary heats, but Albrechtsen wanted to replace Don Hume for the real competition. The boys were convinced that Don Hume was essential to the team, and they persuaded Albrechtsen that only one formation, the one with Hume, could win the gold medal. Hostilities began to form among the crews of different countries. As the date approached, the boys became fidgety and nervous as the weight of the competition finally dawned on them. The boys gathered together nightly to talk and comfort each other, and their relationships deepened. On race day, Albrechtsen found that his crew was placed in the last rowing lane, the worst lane due to its rapid waters. Albrechtsen surmised that German officials had purposely set them up because they came in first in the preliminary heats. That day, Germany had already won the first 5 races, including the 5 men and the individual rowing competitions. Every time Germany triumphed, the crowd roared with cheers. All other countries were treated with either boos or quiet, polite applause. Hitler, surrounded by an entourage of Nazi officials, sat atop a wide balcony over the Langer Sea, admiring his country's wins and the crowd's appreciation. The boys, at the lake, prepared for the 9-man crew race. They started the race badly because they never heard the official starter. The boys rowed and rowed, falling behind. At one point, Don Hume seemed to have fainted, but he woke again by the end of the race, and the crew managed to win the gold medal by 0.6 of a second. Hitler, surprised and annoyed at the result of the race, walked away from the balcony briskly. Joe wept with joy, feeling that after so much loss and pain throughout his life, he was finally part of something special and true. The one set an omen against Hitler's regime of Nazi superiority and foreshadowed Germany's defeat in the United States' hands in the war years later. Epilogue. A couple years after the Olympics, the boys graduated from the University of Washington and became relatively successful in their lives. Joe married Joyce, and they had 5 kids. With an engineering degree, Joe worked with Union Oil and later for Boeing, where he designed B-17s for the war effort. The crew after college stayed close and met frequently, even as their lives took different directions. In 1971, the entire 1936 Olympic crew was inducted into the Rowing Hall of Fame. On his deathbed, Joe, with the help of his daughter and the narrator, wrote his story down into history. Soon after the Olympics, the Nazis resumed their persecution of Jews. They no longer cared to appear civil for an Olympic audience. By 1939, Germany invaded Poland, inciting World War II.